this time with the first CFO on our episode, on our podcast in general. So a warm welcome to CJ.
Thank you.
And the first English-speaking CFO as well. So it's a pleasure to have you. We're looking forward to this episode. And of course, when I say we, I'm not alone. Of course, there's my better part with me. Hi, Gregor.
Hi, everyone. Also, pleasure to have this podcast episode with our first CFO. CJ, you mentioned that you are all around the world. So where are you dialed in from now?
I am in Denmark for once. I'm originally from Denmark, but I've lived a bunch of places, and right now I'm roaming out a little bit, and I'm in the process of moving back to the US. So right now in Denmark, but usually I let people guess where I am.
So you mentioned moving back to the US. This means you have already lived in the USA?
Yes, I spent a number of years with Citibank, and I used to live in New York there. So I had the full Wall Street experience.
Okay, that's very interesting. I think it's also a great topic to start the podcast with. So maybe you can tell us who exactly you are and what your current role is.
Yeah, let me try to do it quickly. So I'll start from now. I'm CJ. CFO. Currently, I work mostly with Formalize. Been the CFO there for a couple of years, and recently started working with a few other startups. But right now, I dedicate most of my time to Formalize. I've done a zigzag career, so I'm probably coming from a little bit different background than many other CFOs. I haven't grown up in finance. I actually started out as a developer way back, and did my own startups and had my own kind of experiences with building platforms and trying to get customers. Didn't go that well, so I ended up going to university instead. And then I took the complete opposite route of that and went into banking and joined Citibank after university. Spent 5 years with them and got the whole apprenticeship finance. I spent countless of hours and way too many late nights modeling in Excel and building pitch decks, and got the fundamentals of finance there. Worked very much on the debt side and raised money for all sorts of things, buying planes and buying companies, and worked a lot in shipping as well, which was just a fun stint. And then for the last 5 years, I pivoted back. So in 2020, I left banking and went back to the startup world. Spent a few years with a startup in Berlin. So I actually also spent some time in Germany. And then the last couple of years, I've been CFO as Formalize. And that has been in a journey of taking a company through hyper growth and a couple of funding rounds now.
Wow. So did any of the experiences that you gained from being employed at a bank for the startup world, or is it so different that you say, well, startup is just new learning for you?
Oh, it's a good question. It's a bit of both. I think the main thing that I took with me from the journey into big corporate was just learning how it works at the end. So Citibank, a couple of 100,000 employees, one of the biggest corporates out there. So I've kind of seen how can it end up. And then when you go all the way back to startup, you're like, oh, okay, that's actually something we're building towards. And especially when we work with founders the founders I work with right now at Formalize have always been founders. They've never worked at a big company, so they don't know how it is. So I remember there was actually a theme when I joined with around 20 people for them to kind of get someone in who had been there and seen that and seen a bigger company and seen how that works. And, there's good and bad things about it, but, they work, these big companies. That's why they keep existing, right? And then the other thing was just I took a lot of my transaction experience, which obviously helps when you are a CFO. So whenever you're doing fundraising or M&A, it's kind of like you've done it so many times. You have all the reps from the banking.
And if I understood it correctly, you joined Formalize when they were around 20 FTEs?
Yeah, so we had around 20 employees. I don't think it was actually FTEs. I think it was actually employees. We had quite a few part-time, but yeah, it was early 2023. They had just raised a seed round. It was actually called Whistleblower Software back then. So maybe I just give a quick recap or intro to the company. But they started as Whistleblower Software and was the single point solution to solve the problem of a new regulation being rolled out. So In those years, the whistleblower directive was being rolled out. And gradually, during a couple of years, the EU rolled out the directive country by country so that all companies with more than 50 employees needed a whistleblower solution, basically a place for employees to confidentially and anonymous report potential whistleblowing cases. And it was a market where they identified very early on that there was some big legacy enterprise players, because the banking industry had this for many years, but the SMEs didn't need this, right? And they quickly discovered, okay, someone needs to build an SME-friendly software that is still secure and compliant, and you can sell and you can trust, but it's not, hundreds of thousands of euros for like what is essentially a very simple piece of software. So when I joined, we were still very much scaling that. And the vision has always been to build something bigger within compliance, but to really use this as a starting point. So the first year was all about scaling towards the big deadline. So the big deadline for all of the European companies was the end of 2023. And as I can imagine, it was a new market popping out from nowhere, right? These SMEs didn't need to do it before. Then it's a massive land grab. And that means the dynamic when you're scaling is very different from the dynamic when you're scaling something where you are creating a little bit more demand. In January last year, we then closed our Series A round. And as mentioned, it had always been the vision to start with the whistleblower platform, but then build a broader platform for compliance operations for companies. And when you look at what's happening in the EU, there's this whole segment of SMEs between 100 and 1,000 employees that historically did not need to live up to as much direct regulation. But with all of this new regulation coming from the EU, there's a lot of new cyber regulation, there's another new security regulation being pushed down. That means that as a company, before it wasn't really relevant until you were a few thousand employees and a little bit more bigger and critical, and then you had the budget to go buy some really advanced enterprise software. But now these SMEs need to, usually they start hiring compliance managers earlier, they start thinking about it. You guys probably know you get an ISO certification much earlier because you got to deliver to someone who's now regulated and need to prove that there's biases. We don't focus on the people who just want the ISO certification. That's more of a space that people like Vanta and Drata has been very successful in. But we focus on the ones that they actually get the certification to supply to, and that is the regulated entities. And the EU is making more and more entities regulated, right? So before it was really just the largest. Now with the new regulation coming out, it's really being pushed down to all the SMEs in the EU.
So in the end, no worries. Yeah. So in the end, Formalize is still participating in the regulatory market with new SaaS evolving from specific, let's say, laws or regulations. You also mentioned that the specific deadline in 2023 was from a quite new market. So in that environment, how did you do financial planning, forecasting? There was no historical data to draw from.
It's a really good point, and it's been something we've specialized in, and I think the part of the DNA of the company has really been that. We did have some. So before I joined, and this is the founder journey, there's always a bit of luck and a bit of timing, right? They founded the company in Denmark, and they were quite lucky that Denmark was the only one who lived up to the first deadline set by the EU. So they were one of the first countries that actually implemented the directive for the 250 employee and above. And that meant that they experienced the first deadline in Denmark before any of the other countries rolled out this directive. And they got this know-how and knowledge that really served them well. So they learned what happened to the partner network. So we also serve customers through a lot of law firms and a lot of partners that we partner up with, right? That can resell the software. And all of these dynamics we then used and basically built a playbook for these deadlines. And then the grand finale was the end of 2023, when all the European companies had the big deadline for all the smaller companies as well. But it's a good point because it was unknown territory. And I will say a lot of credit to our CRO, who's an amazing sales leader they brought on at the same time that I joined the company. And we spent a lot of time the first couple of months modeling out the what we had of historical data, what we had of like historical sales funnel data, because of course, being founder driven, they were very good at using HubSpot and data. But of course, it's a different thing when you then get someone really experienced in and trying to model it out. And that was a really, really good partnership, because we sat down from scratch and said, okay, what is the past performance? We mapped out the cycles. And then we also, to what we'll probably talk much more about, sat down and go, okay, how do we build the right incentive programs to make sure that everyone is optimized? And we had a lot of outbound, and we had a lot of reps to think about. So it was really building towards that and building towards maximizing up to this deadline.
We will come to incentives later on, but before we get there, let's start with the basics. When you mentioned when you join a new company, CJ, what are the first steps that you take as a CFO to get started?
It's relatively simple. I start by understanding the business. But to specify a bit more, really it's understanding the quote to cash process, and ideally also pre-quote, right? But you really want to understand the customer journey. How are people finding us? Where are they coming from? What is our channels? How do they go through? How do we close? And then eventually, how do we convert that into cash? And then, of course, you have the post-sale cycle, right? Like, what do we then do to retain those customers? And that's where sometimes the problem with like Googling information and finding these like articles about things is that they apply to a specific company with a specific product with a specific cycle. And your job as someone joining a startup is always to map out your own and then figure out what applies and what doesn't. And as an example, when I joined Formalize, back then called Whistleblower Software, our first product was very, very low post-sale support. And still is, right? Because you set up a whistleblower channel almost like an insurance policy. You don't really want to use it, right? If you have a lot of whistleblowing cases, there's probably something wrong. So we had a very unique product in that all of our investment could go into the sales process, and very little goes into post-sales, because in order to retain a customer is not them using their product, right? It's just that the product is there, it exists, it's safe and secure, and I trust that I get the notifications when there's something I need to see. Which is a very different dynamic, right? As an anecdote, like we have customers who haven't logged in for like 6 months, get an NPS survey, and then say like 10 out of 10 because they're like, they're just so happy having it. It works. They set it up. They had a good experience with onboarding, and they don't have to log in, right? So the point of that was that when you join a new company, you really need to understand the product and the dynamics, right? Because that meant we could optimize our journey and our investments very differently. Now that we have a compliance operations platform where we have a compliance manager logging in, getting data, getting reports out, it's a very different system and it's very different users, right? And obviously our post-sale journey and our post-sale investments looks very different from the first product.
Is there then a key metric that you currently have in mind or always have been monitoring since joining Whistleblower Software and Formalize?
Yeah, I mean, without disclosing too much, right? Because I don't want to get into the specifics. I think any startup at that stage should have one key metric, and that's revenue. So then it comes down to, like, again, understanding which kind of business is it? Is it ARR or MRR? If you are annual renewal cycle and billing upfront, which a lot of B2B SaaS companies are, then ARR is the perfect metric. If you have monthly subscriptions, then MRR is what you really want to monitor, and you really want to do your trend modeling and everything like that based on that. Because again, you get into a problem if you mix those two. So again, I think it comes down to understanding the renewal cycles and your cash flow cycle and then picking a metric. But I would say until you get to a later stage, the one thing you just keep an eye on is like your ARR, your MRR. Nothing else really matters at that stage.
Yeah, interesting. So you basically approach it like understanding the business from every angle, not just financially, but how the business itself works, which customers you want to attract, and then you get started. Maybe also something that helped you get really started was the Series A funding that you basically were able to raise in January 2024, if I'm correctly informed here. You secured one of the largest funding rounds ever raised in Denmark. It was around 50 million, I assume, or it was disclosed at 50 million. Yeah, yeah.
That's very, very public. So yeah, it was a
So
15.
can you tell us a bit
15 euro
about
round.
your role in this process? So what was your role? How did you contribute to this 50 million Series A round?
Sure. I can talk a little bit general, right? But I think every fundraise is a little bit unique because it very much depends on the CEO you're working with and their experience. Generally, my role as CFO is just making everything smooth, right? So the interesting thing about when you're running a fundraise for a startup as a CFO is that everyone talks to the CEO and that's who everyone wants to talk to. But you are the one behind the scenes making sure that the model and the numbers and everything and the story ticks. And it's very much about that work and just making the process smooth. Specifically with Formalize, I have a very great partner in Jacob, our CEO, and we have a very, very close partnership when we do these transactions. So we streamline it a lot. So it really depends a little bit on the occasion, but it's really just being in sync every step of the process, right? Building out the funnel. I usually try when I explain it broadly, and especially because we are sales-led, so we have a lot of salespeople. I always try to tell them it's not that different from a sales process. The only thing is I only have to close one. You have to close a bit more to reach your quota, but my quota is based on closing one. But other than that, it's the same, right? It's a funnel you run, you track everyone you talk to, you make sure that you have the behind the scenes and you're constantly in sync of like who has talked to who and which stage they are. So that's the broad picture.
And after securing that money, most of the startups try to get into profitability, but they are always expanding first and also investing much into marketing, sales. And I can imagine in these years also in artificial intelligence. Is there any AI tool that you in your finance department are using on a daily basis, and how? Or is it still manual and really like
Yeah, I was gonna say
human-centric task?
it's an interesting topic, and you cannot talk to anyone these days without bringing that up. We in our team haven't reached that stage where there's specific tools we found really make a big difference yet. We're still also in the process of testing, right? I think like everyone else, we're a little bit careful, and I feel like a lot of European companies have the same thing. We are a compliance company, so we are not that like US gung-ho startup. I know some of those as well. They will just like test any tool under the sun, and you try 10 different tools, and the one that works, that's great. It's a little bit different when you're working in a compliance. So even though a lot of the data that I work with in my finance team is not sensitive customer data, right? It's just sensitive internal data. We are a little bit more careful about what we do. That being said, like everyone else, we are really looking into different tools. And I guess I can say it, I could flip it around and say, the way I see it is that I've had some talks with my team and my finance team. And basically I've said, look, our financial operations team is not going to grow. I fully expect us to 10x the business in the next couple of years, but I expect us to stay the same amount of headcount we are now. And that's partly because a team like finance shouldn't be growing linearly with revenue, right? That's sales. We stack on more reps as we get more revenue. But ideally finance should be challenged to constantly like find new tools, find new processes and new efficiencies. And I think AI accelerates that. So that's more the approach we're taking. And then I think we're going to try to do the constraints where we're going to say, let's keep headcount the same so that we're forced to really bring in the tools that maximize automation and efficiency.
Yeah, but I guess it totally makes sense for your part of the business as your compliance, a regular compliance company. But you mentioned one important thing, that the business grows in the sales department, and it was also something that you wanted to get right from the start. You mentioned initially when you started, you and the CRO, you sat down and discussed how you can properly incentivize the sales org to get started and get the ball rolling. So my question now is, how do you use commissions at Formalize currently?
I don't want to disclose too much specific, right? Just to not disclose that, but I can talk in general terms, like but we use commission like everyone, all a sales led company, right? And in general, we design our commission plans to incentivize and maximize the contribution. I think I start by saying I'm a big believer of commission in sales. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have this conversation. And I think most CFOs, unlike what people think, would like to pay out as much commission as possible. The tricky thing of being a CFO is that you have to be the one who checks and makes sure that the incentives are right and that you're getting the right revenue in, and that you're incentivizing your sales rep to close the right customers and close the right deals, especially when you're building a SaaS business where you have a certain lifetime you want to take into account, right? Because that's where people go wrong, is that if they build a program that incentivizes the wrong type of customers, or incentivizes closing deals that are generally not good and will then churn much faster, because your whole, puzzle breaks down if you can't retain customers as long as you expect. So that's, I think, the main thing. My other philosophy is very much keep it simple. So with everything I do, I always try to go back to first principles and just think, what are we trying to achieve and what's the simplest way to get there? And I firmly believe the same thing about commission plans. It has to be so simple that you are a sales rep or you are an SDR, you can just instantly see and feel and kind of calculate in your head what you're getting every time you close a deal, because that's what maximizes it. And then the last thing, as we're talking about this, I think is also understanding motivations outside of that. What are the little things that motivate people other than that commission? Because I think commission is a big part, especially in sales, but sometimes we overlook the other small things that can actually really up performance and increase performance in periods.
What are you thinking of when mentioning that?
We have had a lot of success, and that is all credit to our CRO and none to me, but just me having learned from him. But also I think the founders from the beginning, with really celebrating milestones, having good milestone events and making them company-wide. So I think I can fair enough disclose this, but when we have these like big events and big deadlines, one of the natural thing is to say, okay, you're going to have a period where everyone is going to be under peak load, but they're also going to be under peak performance. Let's make sure that we create milestones that the whole company celebrates and the whole journey there, so that you kind of take it out of sales and into the whole company. So everyone really gets engaged in achieving these company-wide milestones. So it's something we've had a lot of success with, and I always advise founders to go down that route of like set company-wide milestones so you can celebrate with everyone, tie them to revenue, right? Because that's the one thing that matters. Because you always want to tie it to something concrete that brings you further to that goal. But then really make them company right, make them fun, make them memorable. Things that people, and we still have people who like remember these things or buy something for the office. And again, it's something that I saw the founders had done before we joined and was very memorable, right? Because people remember, oh, we got that coffee machine because we achieved that thing, right? So these things, and I think sometimes we forget them when we talk about commission plans, but I see them as part of it, right? And again, I am the financial person, so for me, it's like it's one budget, it's one number, and it kind of comes out of the same thing. But in the end, they really, really bring that incentive up.
Yeah, I can imagine that it's quite powerful to choose specific achievements like a coffee machine or something that's always in the office. People just walk by or really love using it. So they have this connection to the price each day.
Exactly.
You mentioned that this is from a SPIF budget, like a special performance incentive fund, or is it a percentage of your payout role graph that you distribute towards these budgets, or how do you work out?
My experience is it's best not to be that rigid about it. Okay. This is where I use a lot of common sense rather than rigid budgeting, and this is probably also where I differ maybe from some more old school CFOs, right? There's two ways of doing it. One is we just have an entertainment budget that we call our company-wide event budget, right? And for me, when I do my forecasting, I just know that there's a certain amount of money and a baseline I always have set aside for that. And then when you talk specifically with milestones, it pays, like the way that our mentality is, it pays itself back, right? Because if you set some really ambitious milestones that are above your targets, basically overperformance trigger them, and you can say, well, it's not that much extra I'm paying when I'm getting that much revenue. And as long as, it's above my financial budget and above that what I've been expecting to come in liquidity wise, right? Net is a positive thing. So that's a little bit how, and I think that also gave a window into how I think a little bit about budgeting. And I think what has been working very well for us, right, is like, don't stick to a rigid budget where it makes sense. Do a revenue-driven budget where things increase when you get more revenue, right? Because that's how growth works. And I think that's how you need to navigate it when you're a growth company, right? Like if you're growing faster, you want to spend more money. That's the whole investment thesis, right? And then you ramp down your budgets when you grow less fast. And I think people can get too stuck in like, oh, but we created this budget for that, right? And then you challenge it and go, yeah, but we also expected this amount of revenue. So let's loosen up, right? And then you gotta be okay with it going the other way around as well, right? If you don't meet your budgets on the sales target, you gotta go back and revise everything.
CJ, you mentioned you're the financial person, and you are also a person that advocates for commission. Now let's make an exercise here. If you were to build an analytics dashboard specifically for commissions, are there specific metrics, KPIs that you would like to see, that you would like to watch out for?
Oh, that's a good question.
Or maybe to rephrase it, do you currently look at certain KPIs that are tied to commission or like commission specific, like, I don't know, commission payout ratio, or how long it takes to work on commissions? Just to give an idea.
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, the honest answer is no. I actually very rarely dig into it. But I was going to flip it around and say the reason being that we spend a lot more time upfront. So when we design the commission plans, that's where we spend a lot of time going, okay, how does this work? Does this align with the long-term value? Does this align with the AR we're getting in? And again, often the simple commission plans are tied to that. The more AR you bring in, the more commission you pay out. I mean, I'm a big fan of these kind of like linear models, right? Because then you have like usually a booster when a certain target, but I'm a big fan of that. Like you always get a feeling that every time you close a sale, you get closer or above your OTE. But the thought really goes into it before, because then I'm comfortable as CFO that my revenue numbers go up, then I know my commission line goes up, but it's okay because I've modeled it in. And then just take a step back. Then I look at a lot of things you mentioned. Payout ratio is one. Understanding the lifetime of your customers is really big. And as CFO, I can zoom in and look at the commission part, but really my job is to take that little part and then zoom out. And then I look at the CAC, the entire CAC, right? So I always know which part of coming from what. But as a CFO, when I zoom out, I don't really care, right? Because I don't care where that proportion of the CAC is coming from. What I care about is that it's sustainable, it's repeatable, it's durable, it's all these things. And then to what we talked about initially, that's why I think it's so fundamentally important to understand the product you're selling, your customers, etc., is that comes down to your unit economics, right? And that's the sustainability of it. So if you have a very sales-led funnel, a lot of your demand comes from outbound, etc., well, then your commission ratios are going to look different. If you're driving a lot of your leads from inbound or marketing, or if you're product-led, and then you have like starting to add sales on top, it will look very different. So I think people can get entrenched in something because they zoom in. My job is usually to zoom out and say, look, overall, I want the best CAC ratio possible. And then I look at the different segments and look at what we can scale up and scale better, right? And in the end, I want to buy as much revenue as I can within a certain constraint. So that was a long-winded answer, but like that's usually how I do it, right? And then I want to make sure that those are aligned.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And we are already coming to the end of the podcast, as one tradition, we always play a game with our guests, which is an either-or game. So if you were to join a new company with a team of 20 plus sales people, and you sit together with your CRO and think of a new commission plan, a new incentive scheme, and you want this company to scale, would you rather put a stronger focus on fixed income for the sales team or on a commission-based income?
So you mean the ratio between base and commission?
Yeah.
Commission. The more the better, but you have to follow local market standards. US is 50-50, right? And Europe is usually 80-20.
That's true. Usually
that's
in Europe, it's also what we see. It's more 60-40, 70-30. But this brings us also to the next question. Would you rather go with a slice of the pie, well, it's a piece of the pie, meaning a percentage of the closed deal value, or like an on-target commission? So you have, let's say, a 100,000 OTE on target earning, and 50% of this are the variable amount that you can basically earn if you always achieve your target. Would you go with option 1 or B?
Most cases I would go with option 1. I think it's important to feel that progression, but you always design your plan around an OTE, right? And then I would manage performance.
And would you put a cliff on it? So minimum performance that needs to be reached?
And then the last question, and I don't want to put pressure on you, but this is a question where every one of our guests has a common understanding of. Would you use a cap on commission or always uncapped?
Always uncapped. I think I'm aligned. I think it's a misunderstanding that CFOs want to cap it, right? I think some CFOs want to cap your exposure. There might be certain instances when you're very, very enterprise that you want to understand, you want to have it a little bit different. But if you're talking about regular B2B SaaS, where it's easy to kind of see that contribution, then I would want it uncapped, because if you could really sell that much, that's then
so if the company grows, or if the company earns, the sales rep can earn as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I always tell the sales team, the bigger that line of commission can be on my P&L, the better, right? Because that means that we're getting much more revenue in and we're selling much faster. So I am all in favor for paying more commission. So as long as it's tied to the right revenue coming in.
Thank you so much for joining this episode today. It was very interesting to pick the brain of you, to pick the brain of a CFO, and to get an understanding. To sum it up, you are all about simplicity. You're all about understanding businesses when you join. And then, of course, you want to scale it as efficiently as possible. But you're also someone that is totally for commissions and not against it.
I hope most CFOs are, because if they design the program well, it should be aligned with what they want to. So,
all right, CJ, thanks so much, and have a nice evening, and thanks for this episode.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.